Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to see all of you here. I'm glad there's more pre-meds who came along tonight, so I'm very happy to see that. There's one Mat 4, that's good. Three Mat 4s, thank you. The Psychiatry Student Interest Group here was founded last year by Aziz Bawab and myself. Since our inception, we've had several talks hosted by remarkable speakers from Cornell faculty here to Hamad faculty, and even visitors from New York. Speaking of which, it's an honor and pleasure for me to present today's speaker. He is well known for his feats of science that are renowned across the multiverse. Although he travels under the alias Pizarro, he is more humbly known to our Earth dimension as the illustrious and magnificent Dr. David Pizarro, whose genius can only be surpassed by his irresistible charms and outstanding culinary skills.
Almost exactly what I thought.
Dr. Pizarro has joined Cornell University about 10 years ago as Associate Professor of Psychology, and he has since then entertained us with his obsession with morality and the impact of human emotions such as fear, anger, disgust on how we form our moral judgment of others. In addition to his academic interests, Dr. Pizarro has other activities which include DJing for Kendrick Lamar and enjoying long walks on the beach. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Pizarro.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's truly an honor to be here. Thank you, Dan. No, it really is an honor to be here. This is my 5th visit to Doha, and every time I come, I know more and more of you, and it's a home away from home. So I really enjoy it. Thank you for coming in this late time of the day after your long day to listen to me. Thank you, Sharky, for being prepared to ask me tough questions at the end of my talk. I was here for his last year. And okay, I'll get started talking about a particular emotion that I've been studying now for it feels weird to say it, for over 10 years, since you guys were very little children. This might not be working. And that's the emotion of disgust. Now, disgust, we'll define it, is an emotion. Many people who like to make lists of basic universal emotions put disgust on the list. It seems to be a universal human emotion. It's associated with a very distinct facial display, that wrinkling of the nose. You probably recognize it. That is, if somebody took a bite of food and made that face, you would know probably to avoid that food. It turns out that when you look across cultures, across people, to see what it is that brings about, that elicits this emotion of disgust, it's this strong aversive response to certain stimuli, it tends to be, even just listing the things is disgusting. So it tends to be things like bodily fluids, or things that can spread disease, so urine, feces, pus, vomit. Certain sexual acts or visible signs of disease. I don't need to tell you. You probably see these people all the time in your training. But these tend to be the common elicitors of disgust. And so for this reason, many people have theorized for quite some time that disgust is an adaptive response. It is a strong sense of aversion to the things that might contaminate or pollute. Now, I give you these lists of the common universals. That's not to say that you can't get over disgust. In fact, your very training is teaching you to get over your disgust response for some of these things. And it's also not to say there's not a whole lot of cultural learning that is associated with disgust. All you have to do to know that is travel to a different country and try food that you've never tried before. You'll see that the locals are not disgusted by it, but you might actually be disgusted by it. So clearly there's a lot of learning that goes on with disgust. In fact, there's research showing that sometimes parents don't like a certain food, right? So, but they want their kid to eat it. So they don't like broccoli, say. They really want their child to eat broccoli. They don't realize what they're doing, but when they're feeding their kid, they're making a face. And when they do that, they're communicating to the infant that is not a good food. There's also really interesting research. I'll get off on tangents, so I'll stop before I get to maybe slide 2. But there's very interesting research that the disgust made by someone the child recognizes is especially strong. So if you give the disgust of a stranger, especially one who doesn't speak their language is a very reliable indicator for children of who is to be trusted. The person making the disgust face that is like them, speaks their language, is more reliable in communicating that they shouldn't eat that. Okay, so the variety of evidence, it's a universal response. It's a strong avoidance reaction. It's meant to protect you. It emerges very early in life in a certain sense. That is, you can see in infants what many think is the origins of the disgust response, but it's very limited in infants. You can see the distaste response. So in infants, you can elicit that same face, the same face that we make. If I show you a disgusting picture, which I won't do today, well, maybe my data will be disgusting. But you can see this face. If you could just get quinine, you could just put a couple of drops of quinine in an infant's mouth, and they'll make that face, right? And they'll often protrude their tongue, right? And they're trying to get rid of the nauseous substance. So many believe that the origins of the disgust response come from the distaste response. It's something I'll get to later on in the talk when I talk about some of the recent data we've collected. But it isn't until school age, really, that the full-blown disgust response starts happening. Because actually, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, they don't have a lot of disgust. They have distaste, but they don't seem grossed out by many things. If anybody's had to potty train a 2-year-old, you'll realize that you wish they had the disgust response. They do not. They'll play with feces. They'll do whatever. And it's not, in fact, you take a 4-year-old and you tell them, oh, you want to try some insects? Oh, yeah. They eat it like popcorn. Come 5 or 6, they're starting to get very suspicious. In one study, in fact, they were looking at the development of the disgust response, and they used this method where they had snacks in the middle of a bowl, and then surrounding the bowl were dirty Band-Aids, fingernail clippings, a few other gross things. And they just asked the kids whether they'd be willing to reach in and grab the chips in the middle. And at a certain age, they don't care. Okay. Of course, these were all fake and clean, but they don't care. It's a powerful response, even though it universally doesn't get full-blown until school age. But many have argued that the reason that disgust exists in its basic form and why it's universal and why it shares these common elicitors is that it is an evolved response to protect against disease. It is, simply put, our ancestors that had a disgust response tended to avoid disease, and parasites are actually, as you probably know, a big threat to the health and the mortality in human beings. So if there were reliable indicators that there was a potential pathogen or parasite, disease, then it would be a good response to have a strong avoidance reaction. So in terms of just natural selection, our ancestors who had this response would have survived more than our ancestors who did not have this response. It is funny then that it doesn't seem to emerge full-blown until school age. So when pressed, psychologists say it's because we evolved parents to keep us away, to keep us away from the dirty things until we're school age. But there are good reasons to believe that even though it emerges late, it's serving this function. One way that psychologists have talked about, in general, a suite of behavioral responses that keep us away from disease is to refer to it as sort of a behavioral immune system, right? So we stay away from things that might get disease, get us sick by contamination. And we do so in a way that is kind of like an immune response, right? But the immune response, the real immune response, doesn't kick in until the disease enters your body. But by calling it the behavioral immune response, it's sort of seen as a first line of defense against getting contaminated in the first place. So we tend to avoid things. Right? Even before we had a germ theory of disease, we're avoiding things that were disgusting. Of course, it's not a perfect mechanism. We didn't know that sneezes did this until we had high-speed photography, but now that we know, maybe we're more disgusted by them. So you can think of, this is the famous boy in the bubble. I forget his name right now, but he was born without an immune system. He had to live his life in a bubble. He died when he was 17. Of course, got an infection. Immune system is very, very, very important for survival. But you can think of the behavioral immune system as a set of behaviors, psychological responses that keep us away, kind of like an imaginary bubble, keep us at a distance. So when you see somebody that looks diseased, you have this natural response to avoid them. Now, disgust as an emotional response in human beings can obviously be extended to more than just those things that they naturally elicited, right? That is, by dint of having a human being with a full-blown emotional response like disgust, what you can do is through communication, you can associate certain things, groups, people, even ideas, with the properties of disgust. And through this association, you can make them come to acquire that motive, that strong avoidance reaction. So the philosopher Martha Nussbaum points this out. Thus, throughout history, certain disgust properties, sliminess, bad smell, stickiness, decay, foulness, have repeatedly and monotonously been associated with Jews, women, homosexuals, untouchables, lower class people. All of those are imagined as tainted by the dirt of the body. So there are powerful examples of propaganda in which a basic disgusting feature is associated with a human being or a group of people or certain acts in an attempt to get you to avoid or reject or think poorly of those people. So that is why, for instance, male homosexuality is often discussed by people who want to condemn it in terms of the disgusting features of the sex act, to which I always tell my students, pretty much all the sex acts done by people who are not me are disgusting. So it's all you have to do is think very carefully about two people who are unattractive and having sex, and that will be disgusting as well. So it's unfair to use as a tactic. But you get examples of this in Nazi propaganda. There were some early writers in the Christian church who tried to get their monks to remain chaste and not desire women, and they would say things like, "Women are bags of blood and mucus," right? To try to get them to keep away from women, not have sex with them. What they didn't understand is that sexual arousal is one of the things that we know actually eliminates the disgust response temporarily. You probably know this already. But there are interesting experiments where if you get somebody sexually aroused, they're less disgusted by the following presentation of a disgusting stimulus. And it works the other way around. If you get them disgusted first, they're less likely to get sexually aroused. But anyway, we won't get into that. My advisor used to say there are two things that reliably get you to kill your disgust response: love and lust. So if you love somebody like your baby, you're more willing you are less likely to be disgusted by their bodies, and lust is similar. So this is sort of where we started with this idea that disgust is a basic universal emotion that probably evolved to keep us away from poisons and pathogens, but that because of sort of the reasoning capacity of human beings, we can induce it in other people. And so we thought, well, disgust is often used, as Nussbaum points out, it's often used in an attempt to convince people of your moral position. right? To take a stance against particular groups of people or ideas or behaviors. And so in our first series of studies, we wanted to know if there would be a basic relationship between the extent to which people felt disgusted and their moral ideas. So to describe these studies very easily, they were correlational studies, and we were interested in the individual differences in how easily disgusted somebody is. So just like with any other tendency, personality characteristic, height, whatever, you get a normal distribution in the population. Some people are really, really easily disgusted. I am one of those people. Some people are not at all. So we could do the task here. I'll give you a couple of items. This is just from the self-report measure that we use in these studies. This is the disgust sensitivity scale. And you're just asked on a 5-point scale a series of questions like the following. Even if I were hungry, I would not drink a bowl of my favorite soup if it had been stirred by a used but thoroughly washed fly swatter. Right? Right, so you disagree. So 0 to 4, you give a score. While you're walking through a tunnel under a railroad track, you smell urine. Very disgusted or not at all disgusted? It's New York. That is New York. It's true. Would you be very disgusted, not at all disgusted? So a series of those. So we could give you whatever there are different versions of 36 item or a shorter scale, and we can tabulate your score. And what we can see with the scale is that you get a distribution. Some people are very easily disgusted and some people are not. But importantly, this actually captures the difference that you get if I brought people into the lab and had them do certain tasks. So here's a task that we would bring people into the lab and ask them to do. We can bake chocolate in the shape of dog feces. So you bake chocolate and it looks like dog poop. And then you present it to somebody. They know it's chocolate. No question that it's chocolate. Would you eat it? Okay. Right. Why not? You eat things that look like poop all the time, is what you're saying. I thought that was true for me too, until my grad student brought a chocolate mold he had first baked it. We bought a mold and we baked it. And I looked at it and I said, there's other chocolate. Oh, I don't want to eat that. I didn't want to eat it. But I'm very easily disgusted. Here's another task. And this gets at the contagion beliefs. You take a bucket that has, say, dog feces in it. And then you put a string in it. This is a funny one. And then it's a long string. And you bring it over here. And you put it in a bowl of cookies. You put it immediately. So there's no conceivable way in which the germs could crawl all the way. Would you eat the cookies with them? Right. So some people are less willing to do that. Right. So we have a variety of these behavioral tasks. Anyway, point is that this scale predicts people's willingness to engage in those behavioral tasks. There's a whole bunch of them. But some people are just not disgusted. Right? They're not very easily disgusted. So here's what we found when we first did the studies. And this was actually kind of a mistake. We didn't realize what we were doing. We had asked a series of questions about moral beliefs. And at the time, I was a postdoctoral fellow at UC Irvine. And my postdoc advisor said, well, if you're doing these studies anyway, I'm interested in political orientation. Can you just put in a measure of political orientation? Simple 7-point scale, very commonly used. On a scale of 1 to 7, how politically liberal or conservative are you? 4 is the midpoint, neutral. And we kept finding this relationship. That is, the more people reported being politically conservative, the more likely they were to say that they were easily disgusted. And of course we measure other things, because the first thing that you have to worry about in a correlational study like this is that there's some third variable that's actually accounting for both of them. So we did what we could in this first paper to control for a number of things like socioeconomic status, age, religious affiliation. We did what we could to control for the possible variables that we knew might be related to both of these things. And the relationship was still there. I actually ignored it after. I had 3 studies showing that basic relationship, and I didn't want to touch it because I didn't want to deal with anything political. And then when I got to Cornell, Yoel Imbar, who is the first author on many of these studies, who was a grad student at the time, he said, come on, we have to investigate this. So we looked specifically at it. So the first set of studies we published is that across these 3 studies, we found that disgust sensitivity, that is the index of that self-report scale, the mean score was correlated with self-reported political conservatism with the simple correlation of 0.21 to 0.9. It was also most associated when we asked specific attitudes that were associated with, in the US, conservatism or liberalism. It was especially related to attitudes toward gay marriage and attitudes toward abortion. It didn't seem to be associated with other political attitudes, especially economic ones, or things like gun control and welfare. Still, we wanted something better with a bigger sample, so we were able to collaborate with the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who had a huge database on the internet of people who were willing to come on and take studies. And in this follow-up paper, we were able to get about 25,000 US respondents and about 5,000 international respondents. We were able to give them even more measures. In this case, we were able to give a subset of them measures of the big 5 personality traits, other individual differences that we know are associated with political orientation, so agreeable, openness, neuroticism, extroversion, conscientiousness. We were able to get better measures of religious attendance and education and ethnicity, a bigger sample, right? And we found the same thing. Now what you'll see here is on the left, this is a truncated scale. So I want you to note that the true scale is 0 to 5. So it's a small effect. These relationships are not big. They're reliable but small. And I always try to remind people of this because it would be really depressing if it were big. Because a lot of things go into your political orientation and why you believe. And so this is but one of them. In fact, people ask me sometimes, oh, so just can you predict, are you able to predict people's political orientation by measuring their disgust? I said, yeah, but that would be the most inefficient way to do it, because here's a better way. Just ask them what the political orientation is. People don't really lie about that, and that's the only way we know that there's a relationship is by asking them their political orientation. So it's not some secret way of discovering what people's political orientation is just showing that there is one effect. So there's a couple things to note. One is that it's again, right around the same size, 0.17. You'll see standard error bars here. What does this mean? It really only means that we have way more liberals than we have conservatives in this sample, even though this effect is reliable, showing the difference. Way more liberals, turns out, go to websites linked to in the New York Times to take moral surveys. So we did all sorts of things to account for this. We took a random subset of each to match them, and it's the same. And I'll assure you now that it doesn't matter, that this doesn't matter. It just goes to show you how liberal our audiences tend to be. Right? And so we got this across the US and across the entire world. In fact, we're kind of surprised to see it in the world. This is the size of the correlations across the geographic regions that we were able to measure. Again, these are the correlations right around the same no matter where you look. These are collapsed. It's something like 120 countries, but this is a collapse across geographical regions. In Asia, in Australia, in Canada, in Middle East, in the UK. Africa was the only area that we didn't have enough people really to study. Well, Antarctica, actually, turns out to be hard. But you'll see that the size is around the same, that it's the same. So we are getting this, and in these countries, by the way, we ask right-left, because the distinction between right-left, and we define right-left for people, that distinction right-left is better understood than conservative-liberal, because those words tend to mean different things in different countries. Well, it turns out that if you look, and this was a recent meta-analysis looking at a whole bunch of studies, we were really the first to show political orientation, but there are other measures that are associated, we know are associated with political conservatism or liberalism. Here's another thing I should say. Because our audiences and our field tends to be liberal, we often view this as being a relationship between disgust and being conservative. But it's just as easy to say that it's a relationship between being low in disgust and being liberal. That is, it's not clear who's right, if there's a right answer. Probably not a right answer. But it's totally not a bad thing to say that liberals should be more disgusted. It's no more wrong than to say conservatives shouldn't be. Right? But what you find is that across all the published studies that contained a measure, so collectivism, ethnocentrism, right-wing authoritarianism, explicit political affiliation, religious conservatism, that you get an overall effect that disgust sensitivity and other measures of disease avoidance, motivation to avoid disease, seems to be related to political orientation. This is significant when you look at all these studies. In particular, there's a lot of evidence that it's especially the case for that kind of conservative traditional approach to things like sexual values. But this is just to show you that other labs have done this with other measures of disgust that don't rely on self-report. So if you actually show disgusting images and you measure people's physiological response to those images. So if I showed you a picture of poop and I measured your physiological reactivity, that response alone would predict whether you are politically conservative, or to some degree. But especially it would predict your attitudes, that aspect of political conservatism that relates to sexuality. So in this particular study, it predicted whether they were left or right. The more disgust they seemed to demonstrate by physiological measures, the more likely they were to be right-leaning. But specifically, the more likely they were to have attitudes against gay marriage. Right? So it seemed especially predictive of that aspect of conservatism. Yoel Imbar went on to cheat on me and collaborate with other people on this question. and in one of their studies, they found, in a very large sample, that disgust sensitivity, the tendency to report being easily disgusted, was especially predictive of attitudes toward traditional sexuality. Right? So the idea again here is that it's tied. Sexuality is a domain that is very important to the spread of disease and just bodily function. And so you would expect that it would be especially disgust. Its link to that sort of activity would be especially strong. So they found that traditionalism, that aspect of conservatism that's not really about economic views or foreign policy or anything, it's about a particular way of upholding traditional values, in this case especially sexual values, that is what disgust sensitivity seems predictive of. So these are groups who they were described as being in favor of being sexually active, gays and lesbians. And what you find is that the more disgusted you are, the less likely you are to be supportive of those groups. But groups who are in favor of things like groups that are pro-life, that are anti-gay, the more disgusted you are, the more likely you are to be supportive of those groups. And so it seems especially linked to a particular upholding of traditional values. It's traditionalism is the way they describe it. We recently were able to collect data across the world in a way that was even better. In the previous study that I showed you, even though we were able to give these measures of disgust sensitivity across the world, they were still done in English. And so you're getting a sample of individuals who are logging onto the internet, doing their surveys in English. We were able to, in collaboration with a whole bunch, but of course, as is the typical in my field, 30th author is the lead author. We were able to get populations of individuals, samples of individuals in other countries that weren't your typical university samples, and we were able to translate the measures and back translate them and ensure that they were given in their native language. I was in charge of the Argentina data collection, In Argentina, we were able, for instance, to get a radio audience for the most popular radio show in Buenos Aires. So these were real, normal people, not just university students. So across 30 countries in 11 languages, about 11,000 people, we gave them the series of items on disgust and disease, and we gave them this traditionalism scale. So with items like the old-fashioned ways and old-fashioned values still show the best way to live. God's laws about abortion, pornography, and marriage must be strictly followed before it's too late. Reverse scored items, that is, they're the opposite. There's absolutely nothing wrong with nudist camps. This country will flourish if young people stop experimenting with drugs, alcohol, and sex and pay more attention to family values. True. You guys. There's nothing wrong with premarital sexual intercourse. No opinion. Nobody should stick to the straight and narrow. Instead, people should break loose and try lots of different ideas and experiences. Again, reverse scored. So it was these items. And what we found is, well, I should say, in this particular study, we were interested in not just levels at the individual difference level of disgust sensitivity. We measured that. So within each country, there's a distribution, a normal distribution. But researchers before us had done really good in-depth work looking at the parasite load in different geographical regions, with the idea being that in geographical regions in which disease was very prevalent, that their cultures would actually become more conservative. And so there was evidence that this was the case, that cultures that emerge during a time where there is a high degree of pathogen prevalence become cultures that are more xenophobic and more traditional in their views. That is, they're more wary of these kinds of practices that might put your body at risk. They're more wary of strangers. And so we were also testing out this hypothesis that had some support in the previous literature. But we were also looking at individual differences within those countries. And so sure enough, here what I'm showing you plot on the left are the countries in terms of, and mind you, this is historical parasitic load. So it is not current parasite loads. It is the historical pathogen prevalence in the geographical regions. Again, that was work done by medical anthropologists or whatever those people are, epidemiologists, who looked over the data, historical records at disease prevalence. And what you see is that there is a relationship that countries with higher historical parasite stress score higher on average than traditionalism score. But even within countries, the average individual correlation between disgust sensitivity and traditionalism was about 0.14. So again, we're replicating this basic relationship, this time across the world, in normal people, in their own language. Okay, so this gets us to where we've been now, which took us away from the larger scale studies, because what we were interested in was a basic physiological difference. As I mentioned before, many people have argued that the origins of disgust are in distaste. So that the taste sense is linked to the disgust sense because you have to keep bad things away from your mouth lest you get sick. So you see the basic distaste response actually in a lot of animals. You see it early in humans, and it's strong in humans. But we know from the taste literature, and some of you have already studied this, that there are physiological differences that influence the degree to which you can taste something. This was actually quite an important insight for people who do psychophysics, right, who measure taste, because it introduced a real deep problem with how we use scale measurement to measure taste. So it turns out that people differ in their ability to taste certain chemicals, and in general, the strength to which they can taste, especially bitter tastes, but probably all of the tastes. But here was the problem. Before we knew about this difference, we could ask, I could give everybody here a bitter substance, and I would say, how bitter is this? And you might say 9, 8, 7, 10, on a 10-point scale, I'd say. 10 out of 10 being really bitter. And two people might give a 9. Well, that might not be capturing the very real fact that they're experiencing completely different sensations. And this was discovered when people discovered that certain individuals just couldn't taste certain chemicals. These are the two graduate students, hipster-looking graduate students that I have who are working on this project, but they're the ones who've done all the work on this. And we even have more data that I'm not showing you today because it's too brand new. But there seems to be this basic, we're kind of understanding the genetic mechanisms that give rise to this individual difference in taste sensitivity, right? And it was first noticed as sensory blindness to a bitter chemical. In fact, the story is that back in the, I think it was in the 1940s, no, 30s, there we go, that these researchers were playing around with this chemical, PTC, which we don't use nowadays anymore because it might be toxic. And one guy just opened it. I think they were in an airplane sitting next to each other. One guy opened it, and the other guy, the molecules from just opening it were so strong that he was like, oh my God, he could taste the bitter just from the airborne molecules. The other guy is, what are you talking about? This is a flavorless liquid. And what they realized that for one person, they had a very, very strong response. The other one didn't have it at all. So they chalked this up as an example of sensory blindness. That is, one person just did not have a response and the other person did. Well, later research showed by Linda Bartoshuk, a physiologist who was at Yale University, this is where I first learned about this when I was a TA in intro psych, and she came and gave a demonstration, is that it's more like there are three groups that people fall into. Tasters, so non-tasters, tasters, and super tasters. And you can use these chemicals to distinguish between the two. So how many of you have taken the taste strips? Have you used the taste strips? Okay. I wish I had some now, but I didn't want to travel internationally with chemicals in my, weird chemicals in my, that wasn't marijuana. No, just kidding. So you can demonstrate this. I could give this out as I did to my intro psych course, and you can see in the room that some people put it in their mouth and immediately spit it out because it's so strong, so bitter. Some people put it in their mouth and they're like, yeah, it's kind of gross. I'm going to play around with it. And some people put it in their mouth and there's no response. In fact, sometimes they think that you gave them a dud, like a thing with no chemicals. But in fact, that's just because some people, what it boils down to is the density of the fungiform papilla on the front of your tongue. It's people who have a lot of them in a small space in the front of their tongue are able to taste bitter and probably other tastes, the 5 tastes, very strongly. So the experience of somebody who has dense fungiform papilla when I give them a bitter chemical is fundamentally different than the person who, the non-taster who has very low density of fungiform papilla, who nonetheless will report that it is as bitter a thing as they've tasted. So 2 people can be giving a 9 out of 10 on a scale, but actually be experiencing a very different taste. So we know, because we know the physiology of taste, we know that the super taster is experiencing a much stronger taste. There are ways around this that I won't get into, but it led to some really, really interesting insights for how to measure psychophysical sensations like this. But what's great is because we can now measure it with the chemicals, we can directly take a picture of your tongue. So I'll show you how we do this. But the psychologist Rachel Hertz had found that taste sensitivity was related to disgust sensitivity. In fact, these are her data that I'm about to show you right now. Looking at 2 kinds of disgust. This is a scale that divides it up into 3 kinds of disgust. Moral disgust doesn't show a difference. I think there's a reason for that. I won't get into it, but I think that moral disgust is a more metaphorical use of the term disgust. Pathogen disgust and sexual disgust. What you find is that super tasters are more likely to report that they're easily disgusted than tasters and non-tasters. So there was initial evidence that this physiological difference was related to people's difference in how easily disgusted they were in that individual difference. And so we wanted to follow up on that, and we did a few studies that we're currently writing up that use 3 different methods to assess this, from the subjective to the most objective. In the first study, we were just looking at one of the things that has been researched a great deal about super tasters and non-tasters and regular tasters is what kinds of foods they like. So we know that super tasters, because they're so sensitive to bitter, things like broccoli and Brussels sprouts and dark chocolate they tend to like it less. Doesn't mean they don't, because there's a whole lot of learning that goes on, right? So you can learn to like broccoli and bitter chocolate and bourbon or whatever, or scotch, even though it's causing you more bitterness. But in general, these are the foods that they're more likely to avoid. And so in the first study, we actually looked at people's ratings of their perceived bitterness of these foods. And sure enough, we actually get a, again, small but reliable relationship in this simple self-report of bitterness, such that the more likely they are to say that they find these foods bitter, the more likely they are to say that they are conservative, socially conservative. So that was good news. But this isn't the best measure. Just self-report bitterness isn't quite the best. We had people rate other foods, not just bitter foods, but this is what we were predicting, and that's what worked. But we wanted the more objective measure, because one of the nice things about measuring this particular response is that you have much more objective ways to measure it. So this is my intro psych. This is my view of intro psych, if I had a wide lens. So we actually gave this chemical, this is prop 6N propylthiouracil, just so you know. And this is the chemical that is most commonly used to distinguish. There are other chemicals that are used, but this is the most common one. And we gave it to hundreds of my respondents, of my students, voluntary, completely voluntary. And we asked them to rate, and there's reasons for this that I won't get into, but you need to ask them compared to sensation of any kind, because it turns out that this actually matters. But we give them a 0 to 100 scale. How bitter was this substance? Really, when you're doing it one-on-one, it's very easy to give them a score. But this was a continuous scale. We asked them to rate it. And again, we found that in our sample, 320 or so kids, that the more likely they were to taste that chemical as bitter, the more likely they were to say they were politically conservative. There were only a couple of questions in that handout. Very quick study. Okay, finally, the best way to measure this is to actually dye people's tongue with blue food coloring. And what you'll see is the fungiform papilla in the front of the tongue will stand out. They don't get they stay white while the surrounding gets blue. And you use one of these little stickers that you get for binder paper so that the pages won't rip. And you use that so that you have a standard diameter of surface area to measure, and you take a picture. And in that picture, you count how many papilla were there, right? So this is a very simple, but obviously very objective measure of people's taste sensitivity. And here's what we get. Showing you the real distribution, because this is the range in that little, I don't remember if it's a centimeter of diameter or what, but it's about that big. The range at which you get some people, there's one outlier here that had, I think, 47 papilla just in that little area. There were some people who had like 1. Right? That's how much the individual difference is there, but you can see the distribution, right? And so that's the basic papilla count. And what you see is, again, a correlation, modest but reliable correlation between the number of papilla on the front of their tongue and their political orientation, which really, I was surprised. We've pre-registered the hypotheses. We wanted to make sure that this was as strong a test of our hypothesis as possible. We just finished collecting data, because one of the issues that we knew that we'd come up with is that in the populations that we've studied, again, they're largely liberal. So at Ithaca, Cornell, even the most, there are very few real conservatives, right? So on a scale of 1 to 7, where 7 is very conservative and 1 is very liberal, the conservatives there are like 4, right? There are people who are willing to say maybe that they're neutral. And so we actually went, because New York State, on the other hand, has a lot of conservatives. We just finished conducting this study in the mall in Syracuse, where there are a ton of conservatives. So we get a true range. And it's even stronger there. So we're getting an effect of like 0.2 with super taster status and political orientation. So, okay, those are the 3 studies that we've worked on now. And I'll end with that. Hopefully I have time for some questions. With just concluding that there seems to be a stable, robust relationship between how easily disgusted you are and the likelihood that you'll adopt certain attitudes. And this is probably tied to the function that disgust serves. That is, to keep people away from certain kinds of risky behaviors that might be associated with disease. It just turns out to be the case that that is often what a traditional conservative ideology would have. It's likely shaped by this response to avoid poisons and pathogens. But again, it's a small piece of the variance. There's obviously a huge number of factors that are affecting something as complex as your political orientation. But for us, it's interesting that a very small biological difference, because again, this is not something that changes over the lifetime. That is, you have the number of papillae you have. There are certain kinds of accidents that could cause you to lose your taste sensitivity, but by and large, you have what you have, and you're stuck with that. That these small, basic biological differences might actually influence the ideas, the ideologies, the moral notions, the political notions, the social notions that you acquire over life. So thank you. I think we have time for some questions.